Oh,
Good afternoon, Frank.
good afternoon, Professor Spooner.
I think that apart from the fact that so much has been happening recently in the 2 weeks since we last talked, one thing that we can't ignore this week is what's going on in first in Texas and now Louisiana, which everybody is talking about. And the problem is, of course, just exactly how one makes sense of it, how one explains it, because it's such a disaster that's affecting so many people. And I think that, well, the way, what immediately comes to my mind is that we used to take the weather for granted. Even though, of course, in England we talk about the weather all the time because we're always concerned about whether it's going to rain in a few hours' time or not, more so than in America. But we more or less take it for granted. But until about, I don't know, 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, perhaps less than that, we used to adapt to everything that happened in the environment around us. And then our numbers began to grow so that it was more important to each of us to fit into the community that we were a part of than it was to worry about how we were going to make a living in the environment we were living in. That adaptation to our society became more important than adaptation to the environment. And since then, and actually, I mean, it's most people don't realize how short a time it is that human life has been roughly the way it is now, since it's our species has been a global species, and we've had cities as well as food production in the countryside, and trade between all the cities. But we've got to a point now where we can't take the weather for granted anymore. But it's going to everywhere. People, when they talk about globalization, they don't talk about the weather. They talk about climate change, but they don't talk about it in the context of globalization. And the problem, I think, in the modern world is that we don't think of the climate globally, even though I know what's said about climate change now talks about the whole world warming up. But nevertheless, we're not talking about managing things globally. And this is probably the biggest problem of globalization so far, that we talk about all the time how globalization is progressing and we're becoming a global community, but we're not talking about the relationship between the global community and the habitat any more than we're talking about how we're going to manage the global community.
I think that's a fascinating observation you made a few minutes ago about how 7,000 or 8,000 years ago mankind stopped adapting to the environment, to cold, to rain, to snow, to heat, and began to adapt more to their societies. And it's of course it's true. I mean, it's completely true. As society began to provide them with insulation, literally and figuratively, from the need to adapt to food sources and from weather elements, they began to worry about their relationship with their fellow man, and that was the adaptation that they had to go through and endure. When in fact we're really nothing more than human animals and should be, like all other animals, adapting to what's going on outside. And it may well be that we may be forced to rely on those very dormant and latent adaptation skills that we have.
Well, I think that another thing that's part of this argument really is that climate change has been a very important part of human history. And that's something that's not recognized either. We talk about climate change now as though we're causing climate change now, and it's never changed before. But it's always been changing. And if it hadn't been changing, our history would be completely different. The first cities wouldn't have been built in the Middle East as they were. The relationship between different parts of the world would be completely different from what in fact it is. Somehow we've got, as part of the awareness of globalization, we've got to get people to see the relationship between the species and the habitat as an essential factor in the process. Because what in the last month or so we've had, besides Harvey in Texas and Louisiana, we've had floods in, Bombay, Mumbai in India is in a particularly bad situation at the moment with a building that collapsed today, which is related to flooding, and floods in Nepal, in the lowland part of Nepal, floods in Bangladesh, the problem of sea level rise that may make a significant part of Bangladesh, which is very heavily populated, uninhabitable. It's in several different parts of the world that have large populations that this is becoming a really significant problem.
Well, let me ask you a question. I can't help but wondering whether it's the cynic in me that's prompting this question. But I'm taking some sort of perverse delight in the prospect of mankind being forced to abandon their analysts' couches where they complain about the relationship with their parents and begin to actually worry about the weather and how to deal with it. I mean, is this a positive development that could ensue?
It's interesting that as I grew up in England, I was taught how to insulate myself from the weather rather than how to adapt to it. And I think that's generally the way people think about it. But we need to organize life in such a way that we're not simply separating ourselves from the environment, because we may not always be able to do that. We've got to do it in a way that will make us more a part of what's going on.
Well, certainly one would think that the increasing velocity of the rate of globalization is going to make that a lot easier as people begin to adapt to changing climate. They're going to be able to remain part of society.
I would imagine so. But of course, the increasing numbers of people, the increasing densities of population is making it all that much more difficult. Because if the climate does suddenly make a part of the world that is heavily populated uninhabitable, that creates a lot of social, political, and economic problems, as well as health problems. And these, of course, are all things that we keep in separate compartments and are not integrated in the way we manage our own lives to begin with.
Well, let me ask you a question. When an event such as this, which is being classified as a 1 in 1,000 year event, all right, the Hurricane Harvey, all right, strikes the 4th largest city in the United States, it causes the kind of damage that it's going to cause, anywhere probably about $150 billion in economic damage. And it gains the attention of the world. All right, I was on Al Jazeera earlier today, and it's all over Al Jazeera. So people all around the world are aware, but it's on the BBC. People are tuned in. Something like this, how is the effect of something like this on the erosion of institutions that we always talk about, the national institutions, the governmental institutions, the religious institutions? I mean, does it lead to some sort of a global sense of boundary hopping insofar as empathy on the part of people in other areas? I mean, does it have any positives out of it? Can you see?
Well, of course, the reaction in this country has been to brings out the true value of being American, that we all help each other and we'll look after the people who are badly affected by it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not included in anything, any organizational thinking. There's no talk at all about, there's talk about why didn't we prepare for it better? Why didn't we evacuate Houston to begin with? But nothing really about any problem with the infrastructure, especially the political and economic infrastructure, the social infrastructure that would make us better adapted to our environment. I mean, even if it is a one in 1,000-year event, thousands of years go past, and we need to be ready for the next 1,000 years when they arrive.
Yes, yes, yes. Because I'm wondering, as you went through that recitation of the disasters that are going around, we read that all the time. Bangladesh and South Asia, the Philippines, Indonesia, huge natural disasters that occur with hundreds of people killed. And you almost become jaded to reading about them because they happen so frequently. And how do those societies handle it? Are the means of communication such that they're relatively similar to here? Do people in Indonesia, are they aware when there's a flash flood in Jakarta that kills 36 people? I mean, is it something that the country then coalesces around, or what happens in South Asia, in Bangladesh, for example?
Well, it's usually the poorer parts of the population in the poorer parts of the world that suffer from these things, and so although it hits the news, it's soon forgotten. And possibly now, since Houston is not one of the poorer parts of the world, it will get more attention, and maybe it will inspire America to play a more active role in United Nations activities that have to do with, well, for example, the United Nations Environment Program.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But that's something we'll have to wait and see.
Now, as horrifying as it is to admit, when I was putting together the clips for my little television show this morning, I noticed that there was massive flooding in Niger.
Yes.
But I didn't deem it worthy enough to include in my TV broadcast. Isn't that horrifying?
But it's not only flooding, it's flooding in some places and drought in others.
Yes, yes.
And so the point is, I think, that we're too habituated to taking the climate for granted, whereas we've been around long enough to know, we should know, that the climate has always been changing.
Mm-hmm.
And climate change in the past has caused significant historical changes. I mean, the Turks probably wouldn't be in Turkey today if there hadn't been a particularly cold period starting in the 11th century in East Central Asia, which made them move to the west. And various things like that have happened in the past.
Very interesting.
And of course, more people know about the fact that in the 17th century you could roast an ox on the ice in the Thames in the winter.
Mm-hmm.
There was a mini ice age although it's referred to now as a mini ice age, of colder temperatures in the 16th and 17th centuries. So it's not as though it's unknown, but people haven't taken it into account in the way they think about the human condition, and that's what we have to change.
Well, this is very topical, I must say. Not the direction I thought we would take, but as usual, you continue to surprise me. Well, very good, Professor. We'll look forward to next week. Hopefully, We'll have a benign weather week. Thank you.